whenever I have thoughts. But trying to figure out if there's not a better way to teach photosynthesis. I've done this before, but never probably for the same reason, because we've never been this running this far behind. Let's put it that way. So here's what we have left. We've got a strip where we label a chloroplast. That is actually a pretty important little piece. This is nice. Don't have to do it. Where do you find chloroplasts? That's important. This is a leaf. I'm going to just probably stick a little video in there and tell you what you're going to do as far as labeling. Then you get to write the equation for photosynthesis and how's water used, which, you know, we just had the whole big story of cellular respiration and we ended with water, and it seems interesting that we start with water with photosynthesis. And how would you know where your oxygen molecules come from? And water's where you get your electrons from. And then there's a part of photosynthesis that requires light. And then there's a part of photosynthesis that can occur if the light's not there. So this would be like a 24-hour-a-day part, and this is only when there's daylight. Then you start over here getting into, hey, this seems to be our favorite thing we ask, what if we don't really have all this stuff? Like, are these two processes connected in that one, I guess if we want to use the words we've used before, one uses something and so provides like the empty form of the molecule for another one to use. That's our typical kind of question we have. Then we start talking about what light is like, and that we only see what is reflected back to us. Everything else is absorbed. So the light that would actually work for photosynthesis would be all the light except what is green. And really, the green leaves reflect yellow back too. So you could have blue light, red light would both be absorbed. So what's absorbed can be used. But the color we get, the pigment, reflects green. And so we do not use green wavelengths of light for photosynthesis. Then it talks about some other things. These are, carotenoids are kind of an orangey pigment. What happens when you have a molecule that can absorb a photon of light, so knowing what a photon means. And then now we go back to, hey, let's go through the light reaction. Let's talk about the cyclic flow. Then we get into some of the just words that we've used before, but we've got those already done. I'm sure that's really loud. I apologize. And then the whole C4 plants, C3 CAM, I'm thinking we're going to skip that. I'll just tell you that plants have some things that they struggle with, and they have different ways of working around those challenges. And then photorespiration. So this could just be a couple of statements. So here's the reason why I'm going through all this with you. Yes, we can glue these in. No, we do not have to go crazy with them. But what I'd rather do is convince you that because and if, we'll go with that, or when you truly understand cellular respiration. If you think of it kind of like a car and cellular respiration is driving the car forward, you just put the car in reverse and go backwards, and that process driven backwards is photosynthesis. So that's what I'd like to do. I'd like to teach you the big story of photosynthesis in relationship to cellular respiration, and how that they're basically the inverse of each other. So let's just start off with, because we don't have a glue in, because this is just me winging it and talking to you. So let's just put us a little note here that photosynthesis and I told you I was never going to write those again, but here I go. And cellular respiration. And then we'll just make those into that one is the model of the other one. I mean, they're just the inputs of one are the outputs of the other, and the outputs of one are the inputs of the other. So we'll just put inverse processes. And we're thinking big picture here. We're not getting all into the how does the light reaction work. I'll show you that, and then we'll write it, and then I'll show you a little video. So what I want to do is give you a second to look at this figure. I'm going to pause and give you a second. Well, I guess if I pause, it doesn't mean anything. That's silly. I guess you need to pause. So this is the kind of figure that you would see on an AP question. This one's actually from something called a POGIL, which is a self-directed kind of worksheet exploration for students to learn about things. But I'm going to just walk you through what I see. So I see that up at the very top, they give me the equation for photosynthesis, which is carbon dioxide and water with energy are going to be combined. And so these are your inputs. When you have these available, you will, through photosynthesis, create glucose and oxygen. So if my argument that they're backwards from each other, they're just in reverse, inverses of each other, then I should be able to drive my thinking from the right to the left and see if that becomes cellular respiration. So cellular respiration is if you have glucose in the presence of oxygen and you go through cellular respiration, you end up with carbon dioxide, water, and energy. So they are. Now, it sounds kind of silly, but you do need to know those equations. Not really that they're balanced or anything, but you need to know in general what those are. So we'll put those in our notes in just a second. So I have convinced myself, okay, if they're truly inverses of each other, then the reactants and the products for one should become the products and the reactants for the other one. Okay, so let's break this into a more like, what have we done here with this image? Remove me. So they're stating, and I'm just going to start up here in this top left, that sunlight energy is used by chloroplasts, and when you have sunlight energy and you input carbon dioxide and water, so here's the carbon dioxide, water, and energy part being shown right here. The factory is a chloroplast, and when you're through, you will release oxygen as a waste product, believe it or not, and you'll have the glucose that will become part of this respiration system down here. So we would make glucose. Then this figure now shows, hey, we ended with glucose in photosynthesis. We begin with glucose in respiration. We released oxygen in photosynthesis. We consume oxygen in respiration. So glucose with oxygen consumed, and it's in the factory of the mitochondrion, which is just singular for mitochondria, you will create, through this process of respiration, an output of energy, which is interesting because respiration releases energy and photosynthesis consumes energy, and respiration releases carbon dioxide and water, and photosynthesis consumes it. So let's move some of this to our notes. So I'm going to pause for a second, and I'm going to write what I want to show you, and then I'll come back to you. Okay, so I just moved this. Come on, work with me. Here. And what I did, crazy how my head's in the way, is I just moved and color coded. It's hard, I don't know that you can tell the colors. Doesn't really matter, but I'm using color. So I've got carbon dioxide, and this is photosynthesis, is combined with water, and we're going to use these carbons, oxygens, and hydrogens to make glucose, which glucose is C6H12O6, so it has carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens. And the bond energy is going to come from light energy. And we'll end up with an excess of oxygen when we do that, and we'll release it as a waste. And we've learned that when you start with this 6-carbon glucose, as long as that we are aerobic and can go through all of cellular respiration, you end up with glucose being completely chopped into its carbon pieces, and that becomes carbon dioxide, which is a waste. Water is formed at the end of the electron transport chain, because oxygen is going to be the final electron acceptor for those tired little electrons. And when you're done, you have chemical energy that you have made now into ATP. So here's what I want to do. I'm going to think this through as I go. Let's start with cellular respiration, and let's just see what we know about it. So let's just do something simple. Let's think about glucose in its most basic form. So you've got a 6-carbon molecule. These bonds in glucose are weak. Now, we think weak means not powerful. Weak here means not stable. So you've got, and let's just write ourselves a little note, that glucose has weak, so not stable, bonds. The reason for this is that glucose has quite a bit of oxygen. For every carbon there's an oxygen, and the problem that glucose has is that the electrons that are in these bonds are high energy. So let's write that. So the electrons are high energy. Okay, so now we've described what glucose is. It's a 6-carbon molecule, and the bonds between the carbons, really in the whole molecule, but we're just going to simplify it here. The bonds are very weak, they're not stable, and they're highly energetic. Okay, so let's think about that. This is what we've got to, if we're going to make glucose through photosynthesis, we have to provide glucose with a source of high energy electrons so that we can create these bonds that will become weak and not stable. Okay? Because this is what glucose is. So what we did, what we learned, is that when you go through cellular respiration, you go through a series of bond breaking events. That's all cellular respiration is. And so I'm going to number these and go ahead and we'll put what the process is down here where that bond is broken. So I think what I'll do is I'll start maybe with pink, and the very first thing we do to glucose is we snap it in half. we go from a 6-carbon molecule to 2 3-carbon pyruvates. So this bond right here is the first bond we break. So I'm going to come down here and I'm going to put that this is through glycolysis. When you're through, I'm going to go ahead and exit out because we broke that bond. Now I have 2 3-carbon molecules. So I've got to break these bonds. So what am I feeling? Feeling this kind of teal green. Pyruvate is oxidized to acetyl in pyruvate oxidation, which means we go from a 3-carbon molecule to a 2. So I'm going to break this bond in the process of pyruvate oxidation. And since there's 2 3-carbon, right? So when you're through with this one, I ended up with those 2 3-carbons. Then I break off this, I break this bond in pyruvate oxidation, and I end up with, because it happens on both, 2 acetyls, right? So now I've got 2 2-carbon molecules, and I need to get all of the rest of the energy out. So we're down to these bonds. The acetyls are broken in Krebs. And now you're done. You have no more. Every single time that we broke bonds, we released electrons. A lot. So I'm going to just make a note here that as we were breaking these, I had electrons that were released, high energy electrons. Same thing here. So at every step, because we were breaking bonds, we released high energy electrons. The energy from those electrons goes through the electron transport chain, and they call that chemiosmosis when you actually use a hydrogen ion or any type of chemical ion gradient to create ATP, which is also called oxidative phosphorylation when you use oxygen as the final electron acceptor. So then all of these electrons are sent to, don't laugh at my glove, I'm freezing to death, the electron transport chain, and the electrons are stepped down from their high energy states, okay, and at every one of these processes you're going to pump hydrogen ions until the electron is at a low enough energy state that you're going to give the electron to oxygen, and you're going to create water. So using what we've done right here, let's see if we can drive this process backwards. I might just do it over here so I can see it, and build glucose without talking about photosynthesis at all. Just what would you need to do? Okay, so let's think about it. I'm going to need a source of carbons. Let me make myself just a little checklist. So if I'm going to make glucose, I need, according to what I've just done through here, I need a source of, I got to have carbons, right? Got to have carbons. I got to have 6 of them. I've got to have these high energy electrons right here. In order to build this molecule. That's all it is. Carbon, high energy, weak, unstable bond, but high energy electrons in there, which is why it's weak and unstable. And they're all put together of 6 of them in a row. So this is really all I need. Okay, let's think about that. So in nature, we have a source of electrons right here in water, a very ready source of electrons. So, knowing what we need, we're going to use water as our source of electrons. But we have a problem. Oxygen holds electrons really tight. It's highly electronegative. So we're going to come up here and just write ourselves a little statement. So oxygen is highly electronegative, which means that, so I'm going to put therefore, that's what that means. Therefore, it's going to hold the electrons really tight. So it has this high holding, this high, tight hold on the electrons. These situations, so because oxygen is highly electronegative, which the definition of that is the ability to pull electrons to yourself, and oxygen's a bully, it holds them real tight. The tighter you hold electrons, the less energy they have, and oxygen holds them real tight. So we'll put therefore as our big bring it home, the electrons in water, because oxygen is just pretty much got hydrogens tagging along like little groupies, but it's the oxygen's holding of the electrons in water that makes it polar. It gives all the properties that we have of water. So the electrons in water, because we said we're going to use water as our source, are low in energy. So this whole relationship piece, you want to keep that in your head. The more electronegative something is, the tighter it holds the electrons, the less energy the electrons have. Okay, so here's our problem. The electrons are low energy. Well, dang. I said I need high energy electrons. No problem. Just like there's tons of water, the sun is on all the time. So we're going to, solution, we're going to increase the energy of the electrons. So let's put energy here. And we're going to use light energy. So if you think about it, light is going to have to strike something that has some molecule that has the ability to capture that energy and hold it like a charge until, poof, it's going to drop it into a high energy electron. So we're going to use light energy to generate high energy electrons. Okay, so basically what we're doing, right, is the opposite of this. So I'm going to draw that. So I'm going to have a low energy electron. It's going to get more energetic, as in height is showing energy. And we're going to use light energy to increase this until we end up with a high energy electron pair. We'll go with that. You mean I've got those now? Bingo. So we've figured out how this is going to work, how we're going to have the high energy electrons. We're going to use light to power up through some process and provide energy to excite the electrons. And then what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to have an electron carrier. See, you've got to go back to the whole story of the serial killers. Do you just let high energy electrons run wild? No. Nope. We always have to have them contained. So we'll have high energy electrons, and we're going to give them to an electron carrier. And we're going to take, so we'll just put them in here in an electron carrier. And what we'll need to do is we'll have to put these together in some process where that we're going to use a source of carbon, so plus a source of carbon. Well, my brain tells me that we snapped the most carbons off in a cycle called Krebs. I wonder if we couldn't use a cycle to put the carbons back together again. So if we take a source of carbon, so we're going to use carbon dioxide as our source of carbon. So you're going to have carbon dioxide plus electrons, right, in a cycle. And we'll end up with, when we're done, we're going to build, make, because that's all it takes, right? Carbon plus an electron that's high in energy to make these bonds. You'll end up making glucose. Like you have everything you need. I told you, here's glucose. It's a bunch of 6 carbons held together with high energy electrons. Okay, so I gave you the high energy electrons. We took the electrons from water because oxygen is so highly electronegative. Those, unfortunately, were really low energy electrons. But I got it. I zapped them with light. Now they're high energy. So you could use those to make these bonds that are weak and unstable because they're high energy electrons. And I've got to have carbons, so I'll use the carbon from carbon dioxide, and we'll put carbon dioxide together with the electrons, and we can end up building our glucose molecule. This right here, all of this process we just stated, this is photosynthesis. Just by driving cellular respiration backwards. Okay? So now, right here on this page, we have the ability to work our way through adding a few more details, and then I'm going to pop us over to another page, and we're going to answer a couple of the questions pulled away from the glue ends. So let's think about this. I've got to have some system. This doesn't happen just in isolation where an electron is dropped off from here, from water, and exposed to light, and the next thing you know, it's running free, and it's a high energy electron, jumps in a carrier, and then makes glucose. There's got to be some systems here. So this whole process of using light to excite electrons, this process is called a photosystem. Well, it makes sense, doesn't it? Light in a system. So this is going to be photosystem. And they named them, bless them, they found photosystem 1 first, but it turns out that it actually runs second in the process. whatever. But the photosystems do this work. And obviously they're the ones that are light required. Like they're called the light reactions. Because we use light to excite the electrons. This whole process down here of taking carbon dioxide, high energy electrons, we're going to think about it as Krebs in reverse. Okay? Because that makes sense. Krebs is where you break those last 2 carbon bonds, and then this is going to be a different cycle where you make those. So this is called the Calvin cycle, named Calvin. Where did it go? Calvin cycle. And it's the process of using high energy electrons. So this electron is going to be in a carrier. Never comes by itself. So we're going to have electron carriers that are going to be used in this system. Carbon dioxide's used. And we didn't talk about this, but in Krebs it's the same thing. You're going to have to also do some little conformational changes which involve ATP. So we're going to have to use ATP. So carbon dioxide enters Calvin along with high energy electrons carried by an electron carrier with some ATP, and you end up with not exactly glucose. Something that can make glucose. Eventually it can be glucose. So we'll be a little bit more specific, and you end up with that molecule we're used to, which is glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. It's also called PGAL. Either one, they're the same thing, but they're just a 3-carbon molecule like a Swiss Army knife. It can be made into a whole bunch of different things. So that's what you end up with in the Calvin cycle. There's no light required here. So they used to call them the dark reactions, but that made people think that they only happened in the dark. So now they call them light independent, because we don't have to have it. And the photosystems they call light dependent. Okay. Basically, that is photosynthesis. You use your light energy in like 2 different photosystems. Got to have light. That's what you're using. And its job is to change the low energy electrons from water to energize them to be high energy electrons, because that's what the bonds of glucose require. Then you say, okay, hey, I got them all wound up for you. They go to Calvin. Calvin cycle has carbon dioxide with those high energy electrons, some ATP for some conformational change type things, and you end up with the precursor molecule that makes glucose. So that's photosynthesis. Hope that gives you a little bit of perspective, like you already know how this goes. So we could have been even simpler here and not specified which bond was broken, and just made the point that these bonds, when they're broken through these processes, released high energy electrons. So let's be sure we put that there. So these are high energy. The electron transport chain's job is to squeeze these electrons tighter and tighter, and the way that works is you are passing them to molecules that are more electronegative every time. So the electron starts off with, we can even put that here, either in NADH or FADH2, and when it's it's passed to Q, coenzyme Q, which is more electronegative, squeezes the electron tighter. That loss of energy, that because you've dropped in energy, is used to pump hydrogen ions. C, cytochrome C, is more electronegative, steals the electrons from Q, holds the electron tighter. That drop in energy pumps hydrogen ions. And then finally, oxygen takes the electrons from C. So probably, if we think about that, I'm drawing this in who takes it from who, but that might be confusing for you, would be for me. So the direction of the electrons is in this direction. Least electronegative. Q's a bigger bully. C is an even bigger bully, but the biggest bully is oxygen. So this is increasing electronegativity. So it goes NADH, FAD, H2, and I'll just make it visual. Q, C, oxygen for electronegativity. Which is why the electrons are so low energy when because oxygen reduced, which means gains electrons, picks up hydrogen for the electrons too, and you end up with water. So reduced oxygen is just water. All right? So I think what I'll do is I'll stop with this one, and then I'll put in, maybe I'll put in just one, here's the whole process of photosynthesis, like a little video after that. And then we'll just, the next video, here's what the light reactions look like. We need to put those in our notebook. We've got the Calvin cycle over here, but, you know, what does it look like in its own little thing? And then that's pretty much going to be most of what we pull out of the strips. We'll see how that goes. Okay? Thank you. You're the best.